On the morning of June 27th, 2010, at approximately 6:15 a.m., federal agents approached a modest two-story colonial house at 31 Marquette Road in Montclair, New Jersey. The home, with its weathered blue shutters and small vegetable garden visible from the sidewalk, belonged to Richard and Cynthia Murphy, a couple in their late 40s who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade. Richard worked as a business consultant. Cynthia was employed at a Manhattan accounting firm. Their two daughters, ages 11 and 13, attended the local public schools. The Murphys were, by every visible measure, unremarkable suburban Americans. What the federal agents knew, and what the Murphys' neighbors would learn within hours, was that Richard and Cynthia Murphy did not exist. The couple's real names were Vladimir and Lydia Guryev. They were officers of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, operating as what intelligence agencies call illegals, deep-cover operatives living under false identities in a target country, sometimes for decades, building networks and gathering intelligence while maintaining the appearance of ordinary civilian life. The arrest of the Murphys that morning was one of 10 coordinated arrests across 4 states, the culmination of an FBI counterintelligence investigation that had been running for more than a decade. The case, designated Operation Ghost Stories, would expose one of the most ambitious Russian intelligence operations in the post-Soviet era, a network of sleeper agents embedded so deeply in American suburban life that even their own children had no idea who their parents really were. Richard and Cynthia Murphy moved to Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1995. Immigration records showed they had entered the United States separately several years earlier, Richard in 1991, Cynthia in 1993, both claiming to be Canadian citizens. They met, they told neighbors, while both were working in New York City. They married in 1995. By 1997, they had purchased their first home together in Montclair, a middle-class suburb approximately 12 miles west of Manhattan, known for its diverse population and highly rated public schools. The house on Marquette Road was a 3-bedroom colonial built in the 1940s, with hardwood floors that creaked in certain spots and a small backyard where the Murphys grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs during the summer months. The neighborhood was quiet and tree-lined, populated largely by families with young children and professionals who commuted into Manhattan for work. Richard Murphy presented himself as a business consultant, often traveling for work. He carried business cards listing his consultancy's name and contact information. He attended local business networking events occasionally, though he maintained a relatively low profile. He was polite to neighbors, helped shovel sidewalks after snowstorms, and could be seen most weekday mornings leaving the house in business casual attire, carrying a leather briefcase. He was neither gregarious nor unfriendly, simply present in the way that thousands of suburban fathers are present. Visible, but not particularly memorable. Cynthia Murphy was more involved in the community. She worked as an accountant at a Manhattan firm, commuting daily via NJ Transit into the city. She served on the Parent-Teacher Association at the girls' elementary school for 2 years. She attended school functions and volunteered occasionally for bake sales and field trip chaperoning. She was friendly with several other mothers in the area, though not particularly close to anyone. The relationships she maintained were pleasant and surface level, the kind of connections that characterize much of suburban social life. The Murphy daughters attended Montclair public schools. They participated in after-school activities, soccer leagues, music lessons, summer camps. They had friends in the neighborhood, attended birthday parties, had sleepovers. They were American children growing up in an American suburb, completely integrated into the rhythms and patterns of middle-class American life. What neighbors and acquaintances did not know What the Murphy daughters themselves did not know was that virtually every detail of Richard and Cynthia Murphy's lives was constructed. The consultancy Richard claimed to work for existed primarily as a cover. The Canadian backgrounds they referenced were fabricated. Their marriage was not a romantic union, but an operational arrangement. Even their names were aliases built on the identities of deceased infants whose birth certificates had been obtained years earlier, a technique intelligence services had used for decades to create backstopped cover identities. Vladimir and Lydia Guryev had been trained by the SVR in Russia before being deployed to the United States in the early 1990s. Their mission was long-term and patient: establish credible American identities, build stable lives that would not attract attention, and over time, develop access to individuals and information of intelligence value. This was not the dramatic espionage of popular imagination. No secret documents photographed in dark rooms, no clandestine meetings in abandoned warehouses. Instead, it was slow, methodical, and ordinary. The Guryevs' primary objective was simply to exist as Richard and Cynthia Murphy, to build a life so unremarkable that no one would ever question who they were. The investigation that would ultimately expose the Murphys began not in New Jersey, but in New York City in the late 1990s. Declassified FBI documents show that counterintelligence agents had been monitoring suspected Russian intelligence activities in the United States since the collapse of the Soviet Union. While the end of the Cold War had officially concluded hostilities between the United States and Russia, intelligence operations had not ceased. They had simply evolved. By the mid-1990s, the FBI had identified patterns of suspicious behavior suggesting the presence of Russian illegals operating in the United States. These patterns included individuals with Canadian backgrounds whose credentials could not be fully verified, financial transactions that did not align with reported income, and communications that appeared designed to avoid detection. One of the first breaks in the investigation came in 1999, when FBI agents conducting surveillance in New York City observed a meeting between two individuals in a Manhattan park. One was later identified as a Russian intelligence officer working under diplomatic cover at the Russian mission to the United Nations. The other was a woman who appeared to be an ordinary American civilian. The meeting lasted approximately 20 minutes. No documents appeared to be exchanged. The two individuals sat on a bench, conversed, and then departed separately. FBI agents subsequently identified the woman as Cynthia Murphy. A background check revealed little beyond what appeared to be a standard American life: employment records, tax filings, a mortgage, school enrollment for children. But intelligence analysts noted certain anomalies. The Murphy family's financial records showed expenditures slightly higher than their reported income would support. Cynthia Murphy's educational background, though documented, could not be independently verified beyond a certain point. Her social connections, while appropriate for someone of her stated background, were shallow. She had colleagues and acquaintances, but no deep, long-term friendships that predated her arrival in New Jersey. Based on these observations, the FBI opened a formal counterintelligence investigation into Richard and Cynthia Murphy in early 2000. The surveillance operation that the FBI conducted on the Murphys and the broader network they were part of was extensive and methodical. Court documents filed after the arrests detailed a range of techniques employed to monitor the suspects without alerting them to the investigation. This included physical surveillance, electronic monitoring, and what the FBI internally referred to as surreptitious entry operations. Instances where agents entered the Murphy home when the family was away to install listening devices and examine documents and electronic devices. The first surreptitious entry into the Murphy home occurred in September 2001. FBI agents entered the house on Marquette Road while the family was away on what appeared to be a weekend trip. The operation required coordination between multiple teams, surveillance units monitoring the Murphys' movements to ensure they would not return unexpectedly, technical specialists installing covert devices and copying computer contents, and a team ensuring the house appeared undisturbed upon the family's return. What agents discovered was not dramatic by the standards of spy fiction, but it was incriminating. On Richard Murphy's personal computer, forensic analysis revealed encrypted communications that could not be opened without decryption keys. Buried in folders of ordinary business documents were files with naming conventions suggesting coded material. A small notebook found in a desk drawer contained strings of numbers that appeared to be some form of cipher. More tellingly, agents discovered evidence of wireless communications equipment hidden in the basement, devices designed to send burst transmissions, very short radio signals that could transmit data in compressed form and were difficult to detect or intercept. Intelligence analysts who later examined this equipment confirmed it was consistent with devices used by Russian intelligence for communication with handlers or with Moscow Center directly. Over the following years, FBI surveillance documented numerous instances of what appeared to be tradecraft, the techniques and procedures used by intelligence operatives to conduct their work covertly. In June 2004, surveillance teams observed Richard Murphy making what analysts assessed was a brush pass in a Manhattan coffee shop, a technique where two individuals briefly make physical contact to exchange something small, often appearing accidental to any observer. In October 2006, Cynthia Murphy was observed meeting with an individual later identified as another suspected illegal in a New Jersey restaurant. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. Neither individual appeared to exchange any physical items, but lip-reading specialists who reviewed surveillance video noted that Cynthia Murphy at one point spoke a phrase that included Russian words, specifically, words suggesting fluent native Russian rather than typical English-Russian code switching. The investigation was simultaneously invasive and frustratingly incomplete. FBI agents could monitor movements, read emails, listen to conversations in the home, and periodically examine possessions. But the Murphys were careful. They rarely discussed anything operational inside their house. Their encrypted communications could not be decrypted without the keys. Many meetings with handlers or other operatives occurred in public spaces where recording clear audio was difficult. And there was the complicating factor of the Murphy daughters. Listening devices in the home captured ordinary domestic life, homework discussions, arguments about bedtime, weekend plans, conversations about school friends and teenage concerns. The girls spoke only English. They showed no awareness of their parents' real identities or activities. They were, in every sense, American children who happened to have been born to parents engaged in espionage. The decision about when to arrest the illegals' network was fraught with competing considerations. The FBI wanted to gather as much intelligence as possible about the network's activities, contacts, and methods. Every additional month of surveillance potentially yielded new information. But there was always the risk that the subjects would detect the surveillance and flee, or that they would succeed in obtaining genuinely damaging intelligence. By 2009, the investigation had been running for nearly a decade. FBI analysts had identified not just the Murphys, but a network of at least 10 Russian illegals operating in the United States. These included Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley, a couple living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Harvard University, Michael Zatoli and Patricia Mills, living in Arlington, Virginia, and Anna Chapman, a young woman living in Manhattan who appeared to be engaged in talent spotting, identifying Americans with access to information of intelligence value who might be vulnerable to recruitment. The network operated with sophisticated tradecraft. The illegals used multiple communication methods to stay in contact with their handlers and with Moscow Center: burst transmissions like those found in the Murphy home, dead drops where material was left in a prearranged location for pickup, and even steganography, hiding messages within digital images posted on seemingly innocuous websites. In one instance documented by the FBI, Cynthia Murphy received an assignment from Moscow Center to develop a relationship with a New York-based finance professional who worked for a major investment firm. The assignment came via encrypted communication. The message, once decrypted by FBI specialists after the arrests, read in part, "Try to build up little by little relations with him, moving beyond just work framework. Maybe he can provide comments on current affairs, U.S. foreign policy, economy. Our interest is to learn his thought process, his take on current affairs." The instruction exemplified the patient, long-term nature of the operation. Moscow Center was not asking Cynthia Murphy to steal documents or recruit the target as an agent. The request was simply to develop a friendship, to position herself as someone to whom this individual might speak openly. Over time, such relationships could yield valuable intelligence, not through dramatic acts of betrayal, but through the slow accumulation of insights, perspectives, and advance notice of decisions that might affect Russian interests. Cynthia Murphy did develop a professional relationship with the target, attending networking events and initiating conversations about business and policy. FBI surveillance documented several meetings between Murphy and the finance professional over the course of 2009 and early 2010. The relationship appeared to be developing as Moscow had hoped. It was the success of operations like this that ultimately contributed to the decision to arrest the network. By early 2010, senior FBI and Justice Department officials concluded that the illegals were becoming genuinely effective at developing access to individuals with policy influence. The risk that they might obtain intelligence significantly benefiting Russian interests was increasing. Additionally, there were indications that some members of the network might be preparing to rotate back to Russia. In May 2010, FBI surveillance observed Richard Murphy making travel inquiries, suggesting he might be planning an international trip. If the network began to dismantle itself and return to Russia before arrests could be made, the opportunity to roll up the operation would be lost. The decision was made to move forward with arrests in June 2010. The arrests were coordinated to occur simultaneously across multiple locations to prevent any subjects from fleeing once the operation began. Planning involved FBI field offices in New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C., as well as coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, which would handle the prosecutions. On the evening of June 26, 2010, FBI surveillance teams in New Jersey, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York moved into position near the residences of each suspect. The plan was to execute arrest warrants early the following morning before the subjects left for work or otherwise departed their homes. At the Murphy residence on Marquette Road in Montclair, surveillance agents maintained watch throughout the night. Lights in the house went off around 11 p.m. By midnight, infrared surveillance confirmed the family appeared to be asleep. At 6:15 a.m. on June 27th, a team of FBI agents approached the front door. One agent knocked loudly and identified himself. FBI. "We have a warrant. Open the door." The arrest report noted a delay of approximately 30 seconds before Richard Murphy opened the door. He was wearing pajamas and appeared disoriented. When agents informed him that they had a warrant for his arrest and the arrest of Cynthia Murphy, he said nothing. Cynthia Murphy appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, also in sleepwear. She asked what was happening. An agent repeated that they were FBI and that both were under arrest. The Murphy daughters were still asleep. FBI agents allowed Richard and Cynthia Murphy to wake their daughters and tell them that something had happened and that their parents were being taken by the police. Both parents would later state that this was the most difficult moment of the entire ordeal. Standing in their daughters' bedrooms at 6:30 in the morning, still in handcuffs, trying to explain something they could not actually explain. Richard Murphy told his daughters that there had been a mistake, that he and their mother needed to go with the police to sort something out, and that they would be back soon. Cynthia Murphy embraced both girls and told them that everything would be okay. Neither parent told their daughters the truth at that moment, that they were not Richard and Cynthia Murphy, that they were Russian intelligence officers, and that their daughters would never see them as their parents again. Child Protective Services representatives arrived at the house within an hour. The girls were initially placed with a neighbor family, while arrangements were made for longer-term care. They were told only that their parents had been arrested and that they were not in danger. Richard and Cynthia Murphy were transported separately to FBI field offices in Newark for processing and initial interrogation. Similar scenes were playing out simultaneously in Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York as the other members of the network were arrested. The initial interrogations were exercises in frustration for investigators. All of the arrested individuals denied any connection to Russian intelligence. They maintained their cover identities. Richard Murphy insisted he was a Canadian-born business consultant, that his name was Richard Murphy, and that he had no idea why he was being arrested. Cynthia Murphy similarly denied any wrongdoing and demanded to see an attorney. The breakthrough came not from the suspects themselves, but from the evidence accumulated over the previous decade. When presented with transcripts of intercepted encrypted communications, with evidence of the communications equipment found in their homes, and with surveillance footage of meetings with known Russian intelligence officers, the denials became untenable. Cynthia Murphy was the first to break. On the second day of detention, after being presented with decrypted communications from Moscow Center that explicitly referenced her intelligence assignments, she ceased insisting on her cover identity. She did not immediately confess, but she stopped actively denying her real identity. She asked to speak to an attorney. Over the following days, as negotiations began between defense attorneys and federal prosecutors, it became clear the case was overwhelming. By early July, most of the arrested illegals had acknowledged their true identities. Richard and Cynthia Murphy confirmed they were Vladimir and Lydia Guryev, officers of the SVR. Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley were actually Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova. Michael Zatoli and Patricia Mills were Mikhail Kutzik and Natalia Pereverzeva. All were Russian nationals who had been living under deep cover in the United States for periods ranging from a decade to more than 15 years. The Justice Department faced a strategic decision about how to proceed. The evidence of espionage was substantial, but espionage trials are lengthy and can expose sensitive intelligence methods the government prefers to keep classified. Additionally, there was diplomatic pressure to resolve the case quickly. The arrests had created a significant diplomatic incident between the United States and Russia. and both governments wanted the matter concluded without a protracted public trial. Negotiations led to a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government, a lesser charge than espionage, the defendants would be immediately deported to Russia as part of a prisoner exchange. The United States would receive 4 individuals who had been imprisoned in Russia on charges of spying for Western intelligence agencies. On July 8, 2010, less than 2 weeks after their arrests, Richard and Cynthia Murphy, along with the 8 other members of the illegal network, appeared in federal court in Manhattan. They each pleaded guilty to conspiracy to act as agents of a foreign government without notifying the U.S. Attorney General. None pleaded guilty to espionage or to any charge explicitly acknowledging they had been engaged in intelligence gathering. The court proceeding was brief. Judge Kimba Wood asked each defendant to confirm they understood the charges and the terms of the plea agreement. Richard Murphy, Vladimir Guryev, spoke only to confirm his understanding and enter his plea. He did not look at the spectator gallery, where reporters and members of the public filled nearly every seat. Cynthia Murphy, Lydia Guryev, was similarly brief in her responses. Sentencing occurred immediately. Each defendant was sentenced to time served, the 12 days in custody since arrests, and ordered deported to Russia. By the afternoon of July 8th, they were being transported to an airport for the exchange. The prisoner exchange occurred at Vienna International Airport in Austria on July 9, 2010, conducted with the logistical precision of Cold War-era swaps. The Russian illegals, including the Murphys, were flown from the United States on a chartered aircraft. Simultaneously, the 4 prisoners being released by Russia were transported from Russian detention facilities to Moscow and then flown to Vienna. The exchange took place on the tarmac, with representatives of both governments present to oversee the handover. For Richard and Cynthia Murphy, Vladimir and Lydia Guryev, the moment they stepped onto the Russian aircraft marked their return to their real identities after nearly 2 decades of living as someone else. They were met by SVR officials who congratulated them on their service. They were told they would be debriefed in Moscow, that they would receive recognition and honors due to intelligence officers who had served their country with distinction. What they were not told in that moment on the tarmac was how they would explain any of this to their daughters. The Murphy daughters did not accompany their parents to Russia. They remained in the United States, in the custody of Child Protective Services, while authorities and attorneys attempted to determine what should happen to them. The legal and ethical questions raised by the girls' situation were unprecedented in recent American jurisprudence. They were American citizens by birth who had lived their entire lives in the United States. They spoke only English. They had no memory of Russia and no connection to Russian culture beyond whatever small elements their parents may have incorporated into their home life without revealing the true reason for those elements. But their parents were Russian intelligence officers who had been deported and could never return. The girls had no other family in America. The aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents they had been told about were all fictitious characters in their parents' cover identities. In Russia, they had grandparents and possibly other relatives they had never met, people who knew Vladimir and Lydia Guryev but had never met Richard and Cynthia Murphy. Initial attempts by social workers to explain the situation were devastating. The girls had to be told that their parents were not who they claimed to be, that Richard and Cynthia Murphy were not real people, that their parents were Russian spies who had been living under false identities for the girls' entire lives. The older daughter, according to counselors who worked with the girls in the weeks after the arrests, initially refused to believe any of it. She insisted there had been a mistake, that her parents were Canadian, that she knew who they were. When presented with documentation, photographs of her parents in their younger years in Russia, SVR identification documents, records of their training, she became withdrawn and refused to speak for several days. The younger daughter's response was different. She asked detailed questions about what this meant. She wanted to know if her name was real, if her birthday was real, if anything she had been told about her life was true. The answer to most of these questions was yes. The girls' names were their real names, their birth dates were accurate, their lives and experiences were real. What was false was their parents' identities and the entire framework of family history they had been given. The question of where the girls should live was resolved through a protracted legal process. Their parents, now acknowledged as Vladimir and Lydia Guryev, wanted their daughters to join them in Russia. Through attorneys and Russian government representatives, they argued that the girls should be reunited with their family, that separating children from their parents was cruel. The United States government took the position that the girls were American citizens who had the right to remain if they chose to do so. Additionally, authorities argued that the parents had created this situation through their own choices. They had brought children into the world while living under false identities, had raised those children with deception, and had exposed them to precisely the kind of trauma and disruption that had now occurred. In the end, the decision came down to what the girls themselves wanted. After months of counseling and discussions with social workers, attorneys, and psychologists, both girls expressed a desire to join their parents in Russia. The older daughter, despite her anger at her parents' deception, said she wanted to be with her family. The younger daughter said simply that she didn't know anyone else and didn't know where else she would go. In early 2011, approximately 7 months after their parents' arrest and deportation, the Murphy daughters were transported to Russia. They were placed in the custody of their paternal grandparents in Moscow while their parents underwent debriefing and resettlement. The girls entered a Russian education system, began learning Russian language, and attempted to build a life in a country they had never seen before. The reintegration of Vladimir and Lydia Guryev into Russian society was marked by public celebration and private difficulty. Upon their return to Moscow, they and the other exchanged illegals were received as heroes. President Dmitry Medvedev met with them personally. They were awarded medals for their service to the Russian Federation. State media produced documentary features about their years of service abroad, portraying them as patriots who had sacrificed enormously for their country. The reality was more complicated. Vladimir and Lydia Guryev had spent nearly 20 years living as Richard and Cynthia Murphy. They had raised children as Americans. They had developed habits, perspectives, and patterns of behavior shaped by decades in suburban New Jersey. Their children spoke no Russian and understood nothing of Russian culture. Interviews given by other returned illegals in subsequent years revealed that the adjustment was profoundly difficult. The returned officers found themselves alienated from the country they had once known. Russia had changed dramatically in the 2 decades since they left. The economic, political, and social landscape was unrecognizable. Meanwhile, they could never fully shed the identities they had inhabited for so long. For the Guryev daughters, the trauma was even more acute. They were enrolled in Russian schools where they spoke the language poorly and had no cultural context for understanding their peers. They were the children of celebrated intelligence officers, but were themselves entirely American in identity and outlook. Reports from teachers and counselors who worked with the girls indicated they struggled with depression, anger, and a profound sense of dislocation. The older daughter, in a rare interview given to a Russian journalist in 2015, described feeling as though she had lost her entire identity. "Everything I knew about myself was built on lies," she said. "My parents' names weren't real. Our family history wasn't real. Even our relatives weren't real. And then they took me to a country I'd never seen and told me this was my home. How is that supposed to be home?" The younger daughter never gave any public interviews, but was described by acquaintances as deeply withdrawn and struggling to form connections. She reportedly asked to return to the United States multiple times in the first years after arriving in Russia, requests that were impossible to fulfill given the circumstances of her parents' deportation. Vladimir and Lydia Guryev attempted to maintain a relationship with their daughters, but the foundation of trust had been irreparably damaged. The girls lived primarily with their grandparents in Moscow, while their parents received new assignments, likely training new intelligence officers or working in analytical roles, though specific details of their subsequent careers were never disclosed. By 2016, both Murphy daughters had left their grandparents' home. The older daughter moved into a shared apartment with friends and enrolled in a technical college. The younger daughter's whereabouts became less clear, with some reports suggesting she had moved to a different Russian city to attend university and deliberately distanced herself from her parents. The other members of the illegal network faced similar challenges upon their return to Russia, though those without children had fewer complications. Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, who had lived as Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley in Cambridge, both became lecturers at Russian universities, teaching courses on international relations and American studies. Anna Chapman, the youngest member of the network at age 28 when arrested, became something of a media personality in Russia. Hosting television programs and appearing in fashion shoots, her image as a glamorous spy celebrated in Russian popular culture. But for those who had raised children under their cover identities, the return was marked by fracture and loss. Mikhail Kutzik and Natalia Pereverzeva, who had lived as Michael Zatoli and Patricia Mills in Virginia, also had young children who had to be told their parents were not who they claimed to be. Those children similarly moved to Russia and faced comparable challenges adapting to a new country and language while processing the betrayal they felt. In the United States, the exposure of the illegal network prompted debates about counterintelligence priorities and the ethics of deep cover operations involving children. FBI officials defended the decision to allow the investigation to continue for a decade, arguing that the intelligence gained about Russian methods and networks was invaluable. Critics pointed out that every year the investigation continued was another year children were being raised in deception. Another year that when the truth inevitably came out, the trauma would be more profound. The case also raised questions about what responsibility intelligence services have to the children of their officers. The SVR had sent Vladimir and Lydia Guryev to the United States with instructions to build deep cover, which implicitly included establishing families, but the SVR had not adequately considered what would happen to children born into these operations if the operation was compromised. The children became casualties of a mission they never consented to and had no awareness of. Congressional hearings held in late 2010 examined whether U.S. counterintelligence agencies should adopt different approaches when investigations involve minor children. Some legislators argued for arresting suspected illegals before they have children or shortly after children are born to minimize trauma inflicted on innocents. Others countered that such policies would tip off the illegals to the investigation and allow them to flee. No policy changes were ultimately implemented. The FBI maintained that each case must be evaluated on its individual merits and that the decision about when to arrest suspects should be based on operational considerations. The interests of national security, officials argued, must sometimes take precedence over the interests of individual children, however unfortunate that might be. In the years following Operation Ghost Stories, additional details emerged about the extent of the illegal network and their intelligence activities. Declassified FBI documents released in 2015 revealed that the network had been tasked by Moscow Center with gathering intelligence on a range of topics, including U.S. foreign policy decision-making, nuclear weapons policy, CIA operations, and political developments. The documents also revealed that while the illegals had succeeded in developing relationships with individuals who had access to sensitive information, they had not transmitted any genuinely damaging intelligence before their arrests. The greatest success of the network, according to the FBI's assessment, was simply in establishing themselves so thoroughly that they could have become significant intelligence assets if allowed to continue operating. This assessment sparked debate among intelligence professionals about whether the operation had been worth the investment. The SVR had spent enormous resources training, deploying, and supporting these officers for periods of 15 to 20 years, yet the tangible intelligence returned appeared minimal. Some analysts argued this demonstrated the limitations of the illegal model in the modern era, that in an age of digital surveillance and sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities, maintaining deep cover for decades was increasingly difficult and decreasingly productive. Others countered that the true value of illegal networks was never just the intelligence they collected, but the potential they represented. Having officers so deeply embedded that they were above suspicion meant that in a crisis, a war, a diplomatic breakdown, a period of heightened tensions, these officers would be positioned to exploit access and collect critical intelligence when it mattered most. The fact that they were caught before such a scenario developed did not negate the strategic logic. For the general public, Operation Ghost Stories became a cultural touchstone, referenced in films, television series, and novels exploring espionage and identity. The image of suburban families revealed to be Russian spies captured the popular imagination precisely because it dramatized an anxiety that had lurked beneath the surface of American consciousness since the Cold War. The fear that anyone could be anyone, that the neighbors living next door with their minivan and backyard barbecue might be enemy agents, that the most normal-seeming life might be an elaborate fabrication. But lost in the cultural fascination with the dramatic revelation was the human cost borne by the children who discovered that their entire lives had been someone else's mission. By 2018, enough time had passed since Operation Ghost Stories that some of the principals began speaking more openly about the experience. Andrei Bezrukov, who had lived as Donald Heathfield, gave several interviews to Russian media in which he defended the illegal program and argued that officers like him had provided valuable service to Russia. He was unapologetic about the deception involved in maintaining cover identities, describing it as necessary for the protection of national security. When asked about the children caught up in these operations, Bezrukov's response was notably defensive. He argued that the children had ultimately been reunited with their parents, that they were now living safely in Russia, and that any trauma they experienced was the result of the FBI's decision to expose the network rather than any fault of the intelligence officers themselves. "We did not abandon our children," he said in one interview. "We brought them home to Russia, where they belong. It was the Americans who created this situation by arresting us." This framing that the FBI bore responsibility for the trauma inflicted on the children was consistent with the position taken by Russian officials throughout the case. But it elided the fundamental reality that the FBI had not created the situation. The situation was created the moment Vladimir and Lydia Guryev chose to have children while living under false identities, knowing that discovery was always a possibility and that discovery would devastate those children. No interviews were ever published with Vladimir and Lydia Guryev themselves. Unlike some of the other returned illegals, they maintained a very low profile after their return to Russia. It is unclear whether this was by choice or by directive from the SVR. Some intelligence analysts speculated that the Guryevs were deeply bitter about the exposure of the network and blamed SVR leadership for inadequate operational security. Others suggested that the Guryevs were simply too traumatized by the destruction of their family to wish to speak publicly. Their daughters never spoke publicly after the initial interview given by the older daughter in 2015. Attempts by journalists to contact them were unsuccessful. Both young women wanted nothing to do with the public story of their parents' espionage careers and had taken steps to distance themselves from that identity as much as possible. In Montclair, New Jersey, the house at 31 Marquette Road, where the Murphy family had lived, was sold at auction in 2011 after being seized as an asset connected to criminal activity. The new owners were unaware of the house's history when they purchased it. When they learned what had transpired there, they considered reselling but ultimately decided to stay. They repainted the exterior, replaced the shutters, and renovated the kitchen, wanting to erase the physical traces of the previous occupants. Neighbors who had known the Murphys had varied reactions to the revelation of who they actually were. Some expressed shock and betrayal, feeling they had been used as props in an elaborate lie. Others expressed sadness for the Murphy daughters, who had lost everything through no fault of their own. A few defended the Murphys, arguing that they had been good neighbors regardless of who they really were, that they had helped shovel sidewalks and attended school events and been kind to people, and that perhaps that should count for something. The Parent-Teacher Association at the school the Murphy daughters had attended held a meeting in the fall of 2010 to discuss how to address the situation with other families. Parents were concerned about how to explain to their children what had happened, how to tell them that their classmates' parents had been spies, that the family they knew had essentially been fictional. School counselors were brought in to help students process the situation. Some parents used the incident as a teaching moment about the complexity of identity and the fact that people are not always what they seem. Others simply told their children that something sad had happened to a family they knew, and left it at that. The Murphy daughters' closest friends, who had played with them and attended birthday parties at the house on Marquette Road, struggled most with the revelation. One girl told her mother that she didn't understand how her friend could not have known her parents were spies. The mother tried to explain that the friend couldn't have known because she was a child who had been lied to, but the explanation didn't really answer the question of how everything could have been so normal and yet so false at the same time. By 2020, a decade after the arrests, Operation Ghost Stories had largely faded from public consciousness. New espionage cases, new diplomatic incidents, and new crises replaced it in the headlines. The cultural references to the case became fewer and more oblique. The house on Marquette Road was just another house in a quiet suburb, distinguished only by slightly newer paint and shutters. But for the Murphy daughters, for the young women who had been 11 and 13 when their parents were arrested, the consequences continued to define their lives. They remained in Russia, estranged from their parents, struggling to build identities that were not contingent on deception or the demands of intelligence services. They were, in a sense, stateless, not Russian in any meaningful cultural sense, but unable to return to the only country they had ever known as home. In 2023, more than a decade after Operation Ghost Stories concluded, a documentary filmmaker attempted to locate the Murphy daughters for a project examining the long-term impact of intelligence operations on families. The filmmaker was unable to find them. Inquiries made to the Russian government were ignored. Attempts to reach Vladimir and Lydia Guryev were unsuccessful. The few individuals in Russia who had any knowledge of the family's current situation declined to provide information. The documentary was never completed. The filmmaker concluded that the Murphy daughters had deliberately made themselves invisible, had changed their names or otherwise obscured their identities to escape the history that had been imposed on them. This was, perhaps, the only form of agency they could exercise, the ability to disappear from a story that had never been theirs to begin with. Vladimir Guryev would have been in his 60s by 2023. Lydia Guryeva would have been in her late 50s. Their daughters would have been in their mid-20s, young women attempting to build adult lives in a country that was not their home, in a language that was not their native tongue, carrying the knowledge that everything they had been told about themselves for the first decade of their lives was a carefully constructed fiction. There is no evidence that the family reconciled. There are no reports of the daughters having contact with their parents beyond the initial period after arriving in Russia. It appears that whatever relationship existed between Vladimir and Lydia Guryev and their daughters was irrevocably destroyed by the exposure of their real identities. The Guryevs had been intelligence officers for their entire adult lives. They had been trained in tradecraft, operational security, and the art of maintaining cover under pressure. But nothing in their training prepared them for the moment when they had to look at their daughters, children they had raised, fed, clothed, comforted, and explain that they were not who they claimed to be. And nothing in their training could repair the relationship after that moment occurred. The question of responsibility in cases like Operation Ghost Stories resists simple answers because it requires assigning blame among individuals and institutions that were all, to some degree, acting according to the logic of the systems they served. Vladimir and Lydia Guryev were intelligence officers following orders from their government. They were doing what they believed was their duty to their country. The FBI was conducting counterintelligence operations to protect American national security, following protocols designed to maximize intelligence collection while minimizing the risk of operational exposure. But between these two systems, the Russian intelligence apparatus and the American counterintelligence apparatus, were children who had no understanding of either system, no agency within either system, and no protection from the consequences when the two systems collided. Can parents be held accountable for bringing children into the world, knowing those children will be deceived from birth and that discovery is always a possibility? Vladimir and Lydia Guryev would likely argue that as intelligence officers, they were assigned a mission requiring them to build deep cover, and that deep cover required appearing to be a normal family with children. To refuse to have children would have compromised their mission. To tell their children the truth would have been operationally impossible and would have destroyed the children's ability to function as normal American children, which was itself essential to the cover. Can intelligence services be held accountable for designing operations that require officers to have children under false identities, knowing the trauma that will result if the operation is compromised? The SVR would likely respond that all intelligence operations involve risk, that officers accept those risks when they join the service, and that the strategic value of having deep cover officers positioned in the United States justifies the operational model, even with its costs. Can counterintelligence agencies be held accountable for allowing investigations to continue for years after they have enough evidence to make arrests, when that decision means children continue to be raised in deception? The FBI would respond that the intelligence value of long-term surveillance operations outweighs the harm to individuals, that national security must take priority, and that the harm to the children was caused by their parents' choice to engage in espionage, not by the FBI's choice to investigate that espionage. All of these positions have internal logic. All of them can be defended by reference to the legitimate interests and responsibilities of the actors involved. And yet the outcome was that two girls lost their entire understanding of who they were, where they came from, and what their lives meant. They lost their home, their country, their language, their friends, and their trust in the two people who were supposed to protect them above all else. On July 9, 2010, the day of the prisoner exchange in Vienna, Richard and Cynthia Murphy ceased to exist. Vladimir and Lydia Guryev returned to being themselves, or to whatever version of themselves still existed after 2 decades of living as someone else. They were celebrated as heroes. They received medals and honors. They were told their service to Russia had been valuable and important. But their daughters, who had been 11 and 13 years old when their parents were arrested, who had been born and raised as Americans, who had known nothing but the fiction of being part of the Murphy family, were 24 and 26 in 2023. They had spent more of their lives knowing the truth than living in the deception. But the deception had come first, during the years when identity is formed and when trust in one's parents is absolute. The damage done during those years cannot be undone. The lost home cannot be recovered. The trust that was broken cannot be restored. Vladimir and Lydia Guryev served their country. They followed orders. They completed their mission. They were loyal to Russia, and in being loyal to Russia, they betrayed their daughters so thoroughly that no reunion, no explanation, no apology could ever make those daughters whole again. That is the human cost of Operation Ghost Stories. Not the exposure of an intelligence network, not the diplomatic incident, not the prisoner exchange or the failed mission. The cost was 2 girls who discovered that everything they knew about themselves was false, and who spent the rest of their lives trying to figure out who they actually were when the people who were supposed to teach them that had only ever taught them deception. Vladimir Guryev was in his late 40s when he brought his daughters into this world. He was in his early 50s when he had to tell them who he really was, and in between he lost them completely.